Eleanor Whitfield was 81 years old the night her own son set fire to the house where she had raised him. He did it at 2:47 in the morning, believing she was asleep in the upstairs bedroom. He did it because an insurance policy worth $340,000 had been quietly transferred into his name 11 months earlier. He did it because he had already told his wife that by sunrise there would no longer be a reason to keep paying for an old woman who refused to move into a facility. What Marcus Whitfield did not know was that beneath the kitchen floor, behind a false pantry wall his father had built in 1971, there was a basement he had never been told existed. If this story touches you in any way, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment so I know you are still here. Eleanor had lived in that house on Briarwood Lane in Asheville for 54 years. Her husband Thomas had bought it the year Marcus was born, back when the street still ended in a dirt road and the neighbors kept chickens. Thomas had been a structural engineer for the State Highway Department, a quiet man who believed that every house needed a place to retreat to when the world turned bad. He had built the basement himself during the winter of 1971, working at night after Marcus had gone to bed, pouring the concrete by lantern light because he did not want permits or inspectors or county records. He had told Eleanor only once what it was for. He had said, "A man builds a door other people do not know about. Then, if something happens, his family has somewhere to go." Eleanor had nodded and never spoken of it again. Thomas died of a heart attack in 2009. The basement stayed where it was, sealed behind a false pantry wall, forgotten by everyone except her. Marcus had grown into a man Eleanor no longer recognized. He was 53 years old, divorced once, remarried to a woman named Danielle, who wore expensive perfume and smiled only with the lower half of her face. He worked in commercial real estate in Charlotte. He visited his mother 4 times a year, always on holidays, always with a folder of paperwork he wanted her to sign. 2 years ago, he had moved her insurance policy into a new arrangement. 1 year ago, he had quietly added himself to the deed of the house as a co-owner for estate planning purposes. Eleanor had signed because he was her son. She had signed because Thomas had always handled the paperwork, and after he died, Marcus had stepped into that space. And she had told herself that a mother who could not trust her only child had nothing left worth protecting. She signed because she did not read the lines carefully enough. She signed because her eyes were not what they had been, and because the kitchen light was dim, and because Marcus had placed the pen in her hand in exactly the tone of a son. Just paperwork, Mom. Just to make things easier later. On the evening of October 14th, Marcus came to the house with 2 bottles of wine and the casserole Danielle had made. Eleanor was surprised. He had not called ahead. He sat at her kitchen table for 3 hours, talking about his childhood, asking her whether she remembered the time he had broken his arm falling out of the pear tree, whether she still had the quilt his grandmother had made, whether she had been sleeping well. He kept refilling her wine glass. Eleanor did not drink much. After 2 glasses, she felt heavier than she should have. Marcus held her up the stairs, tucked the blanket around her shoulders, kissed her on the forehead and said, "Get some rest, Mom. I let myself out." Eleanor fell asleep faster than she had in years. She did not hear him walk back down the stairs. She did not hear him open the can of lamp oil in the hallway closet. She did not hear him disable the smoke detectors on the first floor. She did not hear him drive 2 blocks away, park in front of a 24-hour diner where the cameras would record his face, and sit down to order coffee and pancakes at 2:41 in the morning. What woke Eleanor was not the smoke. It was the dog. She had adopted a small terrier named Biscuit 3 years earlier after a neighbor's mother died, and Biscuit slept at the foot of her bed and was terrified of everything. He was standing on her chest, barking the way he had never barked before, pulling at the collar of her nightgown. Eleanor opened her eyes and saw the glow under the bedroom door. She smelled the smoke a second later. She was 81 years old, and her knees had been replaced twice, and she had a prescription for blood pressure that she had taken every morning for 11 years. But she sat up that night as though the whole long descent of her life had only been preparing her body for this single moment. She grabbed the robe off the chair. She grabbed Biscuit. She did not try the bedroom door, because Thomas had once told her that a door hot to the touch was a door that killed the person who opened it. Instead, she went to the window at the end of the hall where there was a small side roof over the kitchen. Except the hallway was already full of smoke. The ceiling above the stairs was orange. She could hear the fire moving through the house the way wind moves through dry grass. She thought, I'm going to die in this house. And then she thought, no. And then she remembered the basement. Thomas had built an entrance inside the walk-in linen closet on the ground floor. The linen closet was directly below the hallway she was standing in, and the house had been laid out so that the closet was accessed through a door beside the downstairs bathroom. But he had also built a second entrance. Eleanor had almost forgotten. There was a trapdoor in the floor of the upstairs bedroom she had used as a sewing room, beneath the old rag her mother had made in 1956. A narrow ladder went down through the wall cavity to the basement level. Thomas had built it as a redundancy. He had said, if you ever can get to the closet, use the sewing room. Promise me. She had promised. And then, for 54 years, she had never once thought about it. Eleanor carried Biscuit into the sewing room, shut the door behind her, soaked the rag in water from the bathroom sink, and stuffed it under the gap at the base of the door. Then she pulled back the second rug and opened the trapdoor. The ladder was still there. The air that came up out of the shaft was cold and clean and smelled like the same concrete Thomas had poured with the lantern in 1971. She climbed down with Biscuit tucked inside the front of her robe. The basement was exactly as Thomas had left it. A narrow cot along one wall, a shelf of canned food, a battery-powered radio, a hand-cranked flashlight, a first aid kit. 2 gallons of water that he had rotated every year until he died, and which she had kept rotating in his honor because she had loved him and because keeping his rituals alive was one of the few ways she still had to speak to him. And on a small metal desk bolted to the concrete, beneath a green blotter that had once been on his office desk, there was a steel lockbox Eleanor had never opened. She sat on the cot in the dark with Biscuits shaking against her ribs and listened to the house burn above her. The concrete muffled most of it. She could hear the beams falling. She could hear sirens eventually. She could hear shouting. She could not hear anyone calling her name. The fire department found no body in the ruins. By noon the following day, Marcus had already given his statement to the police, weeping in exactly the places a grieving son is supposed to weep, and had already contacted the insurance adjuster. He had not expected his mother to be alive. He had not expected her to walk out of the neighbor's house that afternoon, suit on her nightgown, Biscuit in her arms, and ask the officer in the driveway if she could borrow his phone. Marcus was standing 6 feet away when she came out. Eleanor looked at her son and saw, for the first time in her life, exactly who he was. He did not step forward to embrace her. He did not weep with relief. His face did something much smaller. For 1/4 of a second, before he controlled it, his face registered disappointment. That was the moment Eleanor stopped being his mother in any way that mattered. She turned to the officer and said, I would like to make a statement. Not now, tomorrow. I need to speak with the lawyer first. The lawyer's name was Harriet Doyle. She was 61, had practiced in Asheville for 34 years, and had represented Thomas once in a property dispute in the 1990s. She remembered him. She came to the motel room the Red Cross had arranged for Eleanor and sat on the edge of the second bed with a yellow legal pad on her knee. Eleanor told her everything. The wine, the sleepiness, the glow under the door, the basement, the look on her son's face in the driveway. Harriet did not interrupt. When Eleanor finished, Harriet asked only one question. Is there anything in the basement that survived the fire? Eleanor pulled the steel lockbox out of the canvas tote bag at her feet and set it on the bedspread. She had carried it out with her that morning, along with Thomas's old radio and the photograph of her mother. She had not yet opened it. She did not have the key. Harriet produced a small set of picks from her handbag, the way another woman might produce a lipstick, and said, "My father was a locksmith. Some skills you do not lose." The lock gave way in under a minute. Inside the box were 3 things. The first was a handwritten letter from Thomas, dated March of 2008, 11 months before he died. The second was the original deed to the house, the actual paper deed from 1969, showing only Thomas and Eleanor Whitfield as owners, with a notarized addendum specifying that the property was to pass solely to Eleanor upon his death, and could not be sold, transferred, or encumbered during her lifetime without her direct, witnessed, notarized consent, given in the presence of independent counsel. The third was a sealed envelope marked simply, "For the lawyer, if Marcus ever tries anything." Thomas had known. Thomas, the quiet engineer who had never spoken a harsh word about their son in 53 years, had known the shape of what Marcus was becoming long before Eleanor had been willing to see it. He had prepared for this night the way he had prepared for every other night. He had built her a door she did not know about. Harriet read the letter twice. Then she read the envelope. Then she looked at Eleanor and said, "Your husband was a remarkable man." The deed addendum was filed with the county in 2008. It is a matter of public record. Any signature your son obtained from you in the past 2 years that purported to transfer co-ownership of this property is void on its face. It should never have been accepted by the recording office. Someone was paid to look the other way, or someone did not check. Either way, the house is yours. It has always been yours. And the insurance policy, the envelope contains the original policy document. Thomas took out a secondary policy in your name alone, held by a separate firm, with your sister listed as backup beneficiary. Marcus does not know about it. It was never commingled with the household paperwork. Eleanor sat very still. Biscuit was asleep on her lap. She said, "I want everything done in daylight, Harriet. I do not want to hide anything. I want my son to know exactly what is happening and exactly why." Eleanor read the letter from Thomas alone that night in the motel room, while Margaret was not yet there, and Harriet had gone home to sleep. Thomas had written it in his small, careful engineer's handwriting, each line perfectly level, without the help of a ruled page. He had written that he had noticed things in Marcus for a long time. He had written about a summer in 1987, when Marcus was 14, when a small amount of money had gone missing from the kitchen drawer, and Marcus had let a neighbor boy be blamed for it, and Thomas had seen something in his son's face that had never fully left his mind afterward. He had written about a business deal Marcus had pulled his parents into during the late 1990s, in which they had lost almost $9,000, and Marcus had never apologized because he did not seem to believe that apology was a thing he owed people who had loved him first. Thomas had written that he had hoped, up until the very last months of his life, that he was wrong. He had written that a father does not want to be right about the shape of his only son. But he had written that hoping was not the same as planning, and that a man who only hopes leaves his wife undefended, and that Eleanor had been the center of his life from the day he met her in a diner in Knoxville in 1964, and that he would not leave her undefended under any circumstance, not even the one he most wished would never come. At the bottom of a letter, he had written a single line that Eleanor read 4 times before she folded the paper and put it back in the box. He had written, "If you are reading this, then I was right about the wrong thing. I am so sorry, my love. The basement is yours. The house is yours. The life that comes after is yours. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." Harriet came back the next morning with 2 colleagues and a stenographer, and a quiet man named Perry, who specialized in forensic document examination. They spent 4 hours going through every piece of paper Marcus had ever asked Eleanor to sign. They found 7 documents with altered dates. They found 2 documents where Eleanor's signature had been traced rather than written freshly. They found 1 document that had been notarized by a notary whose commission had already been revoked on the date stamped on the page. Perry looked at the stack when they finished and said, "In 31 years, I have rarely seen a cleaner paper trail of fraud. Your son was careful, in the way careful criminals are careful, which is to say, careful enough to fool the people who love him, and not careful enough to fool anyone who is actually looking." Harriet told Eleanor that they would not file any civil action yet. They would wait. They would let the arson investigation come first, because the criminal case would do most of their work for them, and there was no reason to tip Marcus off to the full extent of what they had found. Eleanor agreed. She said, "I have waited 54 years to open that basement. I can wait a little longer for the rest." The arson investigators found the accelerant pattern the next afternoon. The diner cameras had captured Marcus at 2:41 a.m., but they had also captured the gas station 2 blocks before the diner, where at 2:19 a.m. Marcus had filled a small red plastic container and paid in cash. He had worn a baseball cap. He had not worn gloves. His fingerprints were on the pump handle and on the container, which investigators found in a drainage ditch half a mile from the house. Danielle, when interviewed separately, cracked within 40 minutes. She had not known he was going to do it that night. She had known he had been talking about it for months. She had known about the insurance transfer. She gave them the name of the notary Marcus had paid to backdate a document 3 years earlier. Marcus was arrested at his office in Charlotte on a Friday afternoon, while Eleanor was eating soup at a small diner near the motel. Harriet called her to tell her. Eleanor set down her spoon, thanked Harriet, and finished her soup. Then she went outside and stood on the sidewalk for a long time, looking at the maple trees changing color on the other side of the street. She did not rebuild the house. She sold the lot to a young couple expecting their second child, and she used the money, along with the insurance settlement from Thomas's secondary policy, to buy a small cottage on 3 acres on the other side of the county. The cottage had a working fireplace and a kitchen garden, and a porch that caught the morning sun. She moved in with Biscuit and 2 suitcases and a single cardboard box containing Thomas's letter, the radio, her mother's photograph, and the steel lockbox, which she kept on the mantel, even though it was now empty. Her sister Margaret drove up from Charleston to help her settle in. Margaret was 78 and recently widowed herself. After 3 days of helping Eleanor unpack, she asked if she could stay longer. Eleanor said she could stay as long as she wanted. Margaret never went home. The 2 sisters built their days around small, concrete things. In the morning, Eleanor made coffee and Margaret made toast, and they ate on the porch unless it was raining. In the late morning, they worked in the garden. Eleanor had not grown vegetables since her own mother had died in 1981, but her hands remembered more than she had expected, and by the end of the first spring, there were tomatoes and beans and a row of herbs along the south fence. In the afternoons, Margaret read to her from whatever novel they had picked up from the small library in the nearest town, because Eleanor's eyes were tired by then, and she liked the sound of her sister's voice. In the evenings, they sat by the fireplace and did not always speak. Biscuit slept between them on a folded wool blanket that had once belonged to Thomas. A neighbor named Wendell, a widower in his early 70s who lived on the next property over, began coming by on Sunday afternoons to help with things that required a ladder or a wrench. He did not talk much. Eleanor liked that about him. He reminded her, in small ways, of the man who had once built her a door in the dark. A reporter from the local paper tracked Eleanor down after the sentencing and asked if she would be willing to talk about what had happened. Eleanor thought about it for 2 days. Then she called Harriet and asked her opinion. Harriet said, "Whatever you decide, I will support. But I will tell you this. There are women in this county older than you who have signed papers they should not have signed. There are sons and daughters who are counting on their mothers being too ashamed to speak afterward." Shame is how this keeps working. Eleanor agreed to speak on the condition that the article focus not on Marcus, but on the documents, the notary, the recording office, and the way a signature can be used as a weapon against the person who gave it. The article ran on the front page of the Sunday edition. 3 weeks later, the state attorney's office opened an inquiry into 6 other elder fraud cases in the region. 2 of the women involved came to visit Eleanor at the cottage. One of them cried in the kitchen for nearly an hour. The other sat on the porch and did not cry at all. Eleanor made tea for both of them and did not try to rush either one through whatever they needed to do. The trial took 14 months. Marcus pleaded not guilty and then, after the evidence was fully presented to his attorneys, quietly changed his plea. He was sentenced to 22 years for arson, attempted murder, and insurance fraud.
Danielle received 5 years for her role in the conspiracy and for failing to report what she had known. Eleanor attended the sentencing. She sat in the second row. When Marcus was asked if he wished to address the court before sentencing, he turned to look at her for the first time since his arrest. His face was thinner. He had aged a decade. He said only, "I am sorry, Mom." Eleanor looked at him and thought about the sound of Biscuit barking in the dark and the cold air coming up out of the shaft and the weight of Thomas's letter in her hand. She did not answer him. She did not need to. On the anniversary of the fire, 1 year later, Eleanor sat on the porch of the cottage with Margaret and 2 cups of chamomile tea. The light was going down behind the ridge. Biscuit was asleep between their feet. Margaret asked her whether she thought about Marcus often. Eleanor said she thought about Thomas more. She said she thought about the long winter of 1971, about the man working alone by lantern light in a hole in the ground, pouring concrete he would never need, building a door his wife would not open for 54 years. She said her husband had never been a loud man. He had never been the kind of man who made speeches or promises. He had only built things. He had built a house and the basement and the marriage and the set of documents that had waited in a locked box for more than a decade until the night his wife needed them. Margaret said, "He knew." Eleanor nodded. "He knew. I think part of him always knew. And he built what he could build so that when the night came, I would have somewhere to go." The wind moved through the maples. The tea was cold. Biscuit shifted in his sleep. Eleanor thought about the things that had been taken from her. The house, the son, the belief that the last name on a family tree meant anything at all. And she thought about the things that had not been taken. Her sister, her dog, the letter on the mantel, the cottage with the morning light. The long, patient work of a man who had loved her enough to build a door in the dark and never tell her. Because telling her would have been asking her to carry the weight of knowing what their son might one day become. Thomas had carried that weight alone for the last year of his life. He had carried it so she would not have to. Eleanor stood up and walked to the edge of the porch. The sky over the ridge was the color of brown sugar melting in a pan. She thought, "I am 82 years old. I have a sister, a dog, a cottage, and 3 acres. I have a chair that catches the morning sun. I have a lockbox on the mantel that is empty because everything inside it has already done its work. I have a story, and somewhere inside that story there is a quiet man, pouring concrete by lantern light. And he is still working, and he is still building, and he is still protecting the woman he loved 54 years after the fact." Some things are taken in a single night. Some things are built so slowly and so quietly that they outlast the people who took them. If you have stayed with this story all the way to the end, thank you. Some nights the fire comes for all of us, in one form or another, and we find out very quickly which doors were built for us and by whom. If this story reminded you of someone who built something for you without ever asking you to notice, send it to them. And if you believe that quiet love outlasts loud betrayal, leave a sign so I know you are still here.